us at a point where the BBC is said to be in crisis and where the board appears to be in crisis too. Now, you'll probably recall when this committee first met you, we were a little bit frustrated that you seemed unable to take a definitive stance on anything, and we wanted you to give us strong, unequivocal answers. So I want us to make sure that we start off on the right foot today. Did the BBC block the head of news from apologising for the Panorama programme before the 10th of November?
I will directly answer that question, but if you may forgive me, I'd like to take this opportunity, first of all, to apologise to all the people who believe in the BBC and care for it and wish it to survive and thrive. I'd like to apologise to the licence fee payer who funds the BBC to deliver its mission. And I'd like to apologise to the thousands of people who work for the BBC, our staff, who work with such dedication and commitment to deliver the output we all enjoy so much. I regret the mistakes that have been made and the impact that has had. Let me now come to the question that you asked. Just, if I may ask you, just repeat it for me so I can answer it directly.
Did you block the head? Did you and the rest of the BBC board block the head of news from apologising for the Panorama programme on the 10th of November?
We go back to the week in which the story broke in the Telegraph, and you wrote to me, and I was writing the answer to you. I heard that the news wanted to apologise for the splicing of the edit with a white spark. I thought that was a necessary thing to do, but wasn't sufficient, because the fundamental issue here was the sequencing of the edit and the placing of the Proud Boys march. I think the real issue here was the impression left that the President Trump in his 6th of January speech had called to violent action, and what we had to apologise for was that, as well as the splicing of the edit. It's my view that editing interviews is a normal journalistic practice. So that in itself is not what the problem was. The problem was the impression that it led, that it was an impression that President Trump had called for direct violent action, and that wasn't the case, and that is what I thought needed to be apologised for. So the answer to your question is, I didn't think it was adequate. I thought it was necessary but not sufficient.
Hello, I'm Bev Turner. Now, it can feel like the money in our bank accounts at the moment does not keep up with the cost of living, and maybe there's a solution. I'm here today with the CEO of TallyMoney, Cameron Parry. Cameron, what is TallyMoney?
Well, Bev, with TallyMoney, you get a current account and a debit card, but instead of pounds, you use milligrams of gold as your everyday money.
So why gold?
Gold traditionally is a great store of value. It has, on average, gone up at over 11% per annum for the last 25 years against the pound. It's tripled in value in the last decade. And in the last 2 years alone, it's increased by 50% against the pound. Banks' savings products just can't compete with that level of growth.
But this isn't just about gold. This is about a currency that you guys have created at TallyMoney. Explain it to me as though I'm an idiot.
So, look, people need to be able to hold their earnings and build their savings in a money that retains its value and remains in their legal control and remains theirs to access, away from government control.
Great. You had me at not exposed to government control.
You should feel safe and happy with your money. You should have peace of mind the more money you see in your bank balance, and that's the type of thing we're trying to deliver and give people choice in the type of money they get to use every day.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Cameron. Thank you.
If you felt that that was the case, then why was there no apology when David Grossman first brought that to your attention?
You mean in the EJSC meetings in January and May? I think that's a very fair question, and I'm looking back, I think we should have made the decision earlier, I think in May, as it happens. In January, you've heard earlier that the report came about, which was about, the context was how well, as we do, constantly review our own coverage, how we did, what went well, what didn't go well, and we examined how we covered the US elections. It's a general point. And the report came back, as you've said, that coverage was on the whole excellent, but there were some real issues there. Well, I invited, and there was at that meeting also coverage of the Arabic service, which we may come back to. I invited, which is normal, for news to give me a formal response to that research. That response came in May. When that response came, one thing I'd like to make clear is that this was a constructive discussion that took place at the EGSC. Some very important observations were made in that report, which the executives took on. For me, one of the most interesting ones was the recognition about the story selection idea, and I have a letter in front of me, the news report, you've got it, which said the BBC infrastructure is heavily resourced in the democratic areas, and we need to move into other parts of the US to get a better sense of opinion within it. And that is an action that's going to be taken, and there's going to be a movement of which our resources tap into not just the democratic heartlands where we have got, in a way, over too many resources that we need to move it out. I give that example simply to tell you all that this wasn't a discussion where you had a defensive news response to some very serious issues. So that was it. When it came to the Panorama edit, there was a difference of opinion across the board. And looking back, I think it would have been better for us to pursue it then. I completely accept that. And as we go into my own understanding of how we got here, it seems to me, along with the editorial and the governance, which are important issues which we'll unpack, I think there is an issue about how quickly we respond, the speed of our response. Why do we not do it quickly enough? Why do we take so much time? And this was another illustration of that. We should have, as a collective, we should have pursued it to the end and got to the bottom of it and not wait, as we did, till it became public discourse. I mean, I have a lot of things to say about my relationship with Mr. Prescott and that report and what he did.
We've got lots of questions to come on to along that line. But what I'm trying to get to, there's been a lot of speculation in the media that it was the inaction and the delay by the BBC board, and it's reported in the press as that there was a dispute in the BBC board that has caused so much of the dramas ever since. I'm just really interested to know why it took so long. Why didn't you get on the front foot? If you'd have got on the front foot and, either with an apology or with a robust defence, either I think, would have been an acceptable way of responding to this. But it's that huge delay. So, I mean, why? What was causing the delay? What were your reasons for delaying?
It seems to me there are two types of timeline. One is the one that began with the EGSC report in January.
I'm talking about when the
and then there's a week
reported.
after the report was in some way leaked to the public and the Telegraph. Do you mean that particular?
I mean, as soon as the Telegraph started publishing this memo and its coverage of it, there was just a vacuum in the BBC for nearly a week, where there was no comment given of any meaningful way to the substance of it. Why didn't you get on the front foot with either an apology or some kind of defence of what had happened?
But precisely for the question you've just raised, I needed to understand what went wrong and to get the right answer. Getting the right answer was really important.
You knew what went wrong because you'd already had the Grossman report into this and your own...
When we went in that week, I asked the Director General to review, because I said we reflected on it, to review the clip and whether there were any serious editorial breaches. There were, as an outcome of that, and that was the research that had to be done to get it right. It took time to get it right. We knew what the actual apology was for. I said it wasn't just about the splicing, the editing, it was about the impression, and that had to be done properly and investigated thoroughly. As well as that, I was writing a response to you from the board. I have 13 board members, and I needed to make sure that they were aware about what I was writing, and I had their support. I admit, that did take time, and of course it would always be better to be able to get out quickly. But it's as important for me to get it right and to get it supported by the board.
If the BBC had responded quicker, do you think that the resignations might not have happened?
That's a hypothetical I can't answer. All I will say is that I think the resignation of the CEO of News was a very honourable act. I think it was right of her to take responsibility for an error in her division. As she herself said, the buck stops with me. And I said, in public life, it's rare to find people who accept that something went wrong in their own division and accept responsibility and take responsibility, and I applaud her for that.
Your culture and media editor, Katie Razzle, reported that Deborah Turness became more and more angry and frustrated as the week went on because she was prevented by the board from putting out that apology. Was that in some way to blame for the fact that she then resigned from her post?
You would have to ask her. I've already repeated, I thought the apology that was on the table was necessary but not sufficient.
Did you try and stop her from resigning?
I spoke to Director General about it. The resignation or otherwise of the head of news is a matter for the Director General, not for the board or for the chair. My job is to test and challenge the Director General. It's an operational editorial matter, who he hires and who he doesn't hire underneath him.
Then the Director General resigned as well. Did you try and stop him from resigning?
I did indeed, and I spent a great deal of time. I do not think the Director General should have resigned. I think that the act by the Director of News was an honourable and proper act. I think she took responsibility, for which I will again say I applaud her for doing so. I do not think that meant that the Director General had also had to resign. However, when you read the Director General's reason for resigning, certainly this was one factor, but he also says there were many other factors that led to that. I wish, and can I say the board wishes, that the Director General had not resigned. He had our full confidence throughout.
Sure.
Yes, Cam.
An organisation as large as the BBC, I would imagine it should have occurred to you that you could have put out an initial statement while you were still trying to get to grips with the gravity of what had happened prior to a full apology. Did you receive pressure from anybody else on that board to delay such an apology?
Absolutely not. What I would say, we did put out a full statement, which was, I think looking back, rather vanilla in its statement, as corporate BBC tends to do. And we did do it to hold, because I needed to put out a fuller statement, but I needed to be sure and I was right about what I was saying. This was a very, very important error, and I needed to make sure that what I was apologising for was fully sourced and fully right. It needed to be right, and it took its time.
The resignation of the Director General is quite a big deal, is it not? When you tried to dissuade Tim Davie from his resignation, how did that conversation go?
I don't think it is right for me to discuss private conversations with me and the Director General. Well,
it might be if the BBC is at stake.
Well, I think confidential statements, conversations need to remain confidential. But let me answer your question. I know Tim, and I've got to know Tim very well over the last 18 months. He's an outstanding Director General. He is extraordinarily good. His energy, his dedication, his commitment to the BBC cannot be gainsaid.
But his commitment was broken.
What? Well, as you know in his statement, he felt responsible as Editor-in-Chief for the error. My view was the responsibility was taken by the Chief of News, and that was proportionate.
Thanks, Chair.
Can I just quickly take you back to the response to the committee's letter, November the 4th? You apologised on behalf of the BBC for the way that the Trump speech on the 6th of January were edited. Your words were, the BBC does accept the way that the speech was edited did give the impression of a direct call for violent action. The BBC would like to apologise for that error of judgment. Dr. Shah, I've had a look at the BBC editorial guidelines, section 3.4.25 of the BBC's editorial policy. That says, for news, factual and some factual entertainment content, unless clearly signalled to the audience or other reconstructions, content makers should not normally intercut shots and sequences if the resulting juxtaposition of material leads to a materially misleading impression of events. It seems quite clear to me that the way that both the Newsnight and Panorama edited this clip broke those BBC editorial guidelines. So what I'm just trying to get to grips with is why it took a year to apologise for this failing, despite the EGSC, which you chair, having concerns about this programme on 3 separate occasions, and why no action was taken despite the fact that there was a clear evidence of a breach of editorial guidelines.
As I said, in the January meeting, that report came out. I then invited the news division to give me a formal response to it. That response took place in May, and we discussed it then, and there was a different set of opinions around it. There was a plausible case that this edit, because the point of the programme was to deliver to the British audience, because it was about the supporters for President Trump and what they were learning. So there was a case for, as it were, the edit. This was discussed and debated, and there was a difference of opinion. I've already said we should have pursued it further at that time. And by pursuing it further, we should have investigated it in detail with the people responsible in the BBC to do that. You must remember, that is an operational matter and not a matter for, in governance terms, for the non-execs. But it is a matter which we could have pursued harder, is what I would say, and we should have done. Had we done so, then what you've just read out would have come out, and there would have been a formal response that this did breach that, and we would have then taken on.
What was the tipping point that prompted your apology? Was it the 500 letters of complaint to the BBC? Was it the resignation of the Director General? Was it the memo?
No, straight away.
Wait a second.
Yes.
Or was it the threat of legal action from the President of the United States?
I'm sorry, say that again. The last one?
The threat of legal action from the President of the United States. What was the sort of tipping point in suddenly deciding that apology was forthcoming? The memo, the Director General going, the letters of complaint, or the threat of legal action from the President?
As I wrote to you, when the memo entered public discourse, there were a lot of complaints about it. And we decided at that moment to reflect and review the decision. And that's when we came out with the outcome that, yes, it was a mistake. It was an error of judgment, and that's what I wrote to you, and then later on.
Just to be clear, had this not have been covered by the memo and prompted all these letters of complaint, that would probably have never, it would never have come back, it would never have risen back to the surface of the EGSC.
It's worth noting that in when we discussed it, there had been no complaints to the BBC News about this. So there was no, if that had happened, we could have looked at it. As I said, again, there was a discussion at the board about this, and there was a debate, and because there had been no formal complaints, we let it rest. As you probably all know, very soon after that, I was uncomfortable with that outcome and that result, and I initiated. It wasn't the only reason. I had a number of things over the time I've been chair, which I worried about the workings of this committee, whether it was properly defined, whether the relationship with the board, with the main board, was precise enough, with the terms of reference with the advisors, whether the composition was good. And I invited Chris Saul in June to look again at, long before this broke. I did think there were things to be done, and that process was underway. One of those things, and maybe Caroline will talk about it, one of those things was, what is the mechanic when at a board, at a committee, there is disagreement within it? How do we deal with that? How do we deal with that in such a way that we don't cross that line between governance and editorial? It's an important line we hold, but it does seem to me that this is thrown up there. As I said, one of the issues I have to face is, what were the governance failures here? What were the process failures? And one of them is that. And I think we do need to find a way, and Caroline is going to be looking into that. I'd started it with Chris Saul. Chris Saul had some interim findings. We were underway. I should say, as you know, I listened intently to your conversation with Mr. Prescott. I met him several times during that period. I invited him to talk to Crystal, and they met to discuss it. After the letter went out, I talked to him again. After we met the board, I talked to him, and I said, I would like you to be engaged in fixing what's wrong with the EGSC, how we can get it to a state where you would not have cause to write such a letter again. I did that. He seemed to rise to it. So perfect. So we were going to carry on. Don't think this committee should think I ignored Mr. Prescott. I did not. I think he raised some important questions we need to answer. I've already said I don't think it was a rounded picture of what actually happened in the EGSC, and I think you've heard from your other witness that in fact the executive took many actions, detailed actions. So it wasn't just a case of a report coming out and a defensive reaction. That just is not an accurate account of what happened.
It was reported in the press quite a lot that the reason for the delay in the board responding to our letter, and indeed sort of opining in any way on what had happened, was because there was a big difference of opinion at board level. Is that true?
In May? Do you mean?
No, we're talking about recently in response to all the news that came out. You lost two very key, very senior members of the BBC team, and then still we waited for you to say anything.
At the board meeting in October, when we discussed the memo, we discussed it at length, and there was a certain repeating of what happened in the EGSC, but it was important we discussed it, and there was some differences of opinion, but we did agree on the next step at that meeting, and the next step was for me to go back to Mr. Prescott, discuss his email to the board, and invite him to be part of reviewing how the EGSC could work better, to which he agreed. And then, as we know, a few days later, it was all over the papers.
Memo hit the papers, but that's not what I asked you. What I asked you is, there was this big delay between the newspapers covering this story and the board coming out with either a statement or a response to the letter that we wrote. And it's been reported in the press that the reason for that delay was because there was a big dispute within the board about how to respond. There was, in some cases, people said chaos in the board. How true is that?
There was neither chaos nor that. The delay was, you wrote to me on the Tuesday, I replied to you on the Monday. That was the deadline you gave me. During that time, I wanted to investigate it, what went wrong, and get it right, and I needed to make sure the board were with me. And we discussed this. I don't think there was any chaos or difficulty there.
But I think, yes, if I could just add, because I was obviously part of some of those discussions, there was a continuing and sharp difference of opinion between certainly the chairman and me and some others on the board with the director of news about whether we were going to apologise just for the edit, or whether the impact of the edit and indeed the positioning of the Proud Boys material had given a misleading impression. We felt that it had. And the news continued to maintain that actually the impression given, despite the edit, was correct, because the gist of the speech by Trump had, for example, the use of the word fight 15 times and only talked about peace once. And they felt that the edit was justified, but it should have been a more transparent edit. We felt that the edit had led to a more profound problem. And indeed, your quotation of the editorial guidelines is absolutely right. We felt it violated them.
Thank you. Natasha?